In 1898, amateur photographer Secondo Pia stood in a darkroom and watched the first ever photograph of the Shroud of Turin emerge from chemical developer. When Pia inverted the image, the faint, blurry markings on the linen resolved into a striking, lifelike human face. The cloth itself had functioned as a perfect photographic negative decades before photography was even invented. Despite this technical impossibility, a publicized carbon dating study in 1988 dismissed the artifact as a 13th century hoax, leading many to assume the case was closed. Modern optics, however, show that the image contains zero dye, ink, or paint. Instead of a surface layer, the discoloration is a microscopic chemical change that exists only 2 microns deep on the outermost surface of the fibers. When researchers scanned the cloth using a NASA VP8 image analyzer, a tool built to map the topography of planets, they found perfect 3D spatial data encoded in the fabric. A standard 2D photograph or painting cannot produce a 3D topographical mesh like this. Because the artifact carries embedded spatial data and lacks any physical pigment, it cannot be categorized as an ordinary piece of art. The scientific community is now forced to treat the shroud as an active 2,000-year-old forensic cold case. To understand what happened to the victim, forensic pathologists analyze the cloth for trauma, matching a 1st-century Roman execution in Judea. The macroscopic evidence is severe. The cloth bears 372 distinct wounds across the back and chest. These lacerations match the dimensions and strike patterns of a Roman flagrum, a whip tipped with lead weights. Medieval artists typically depicted crucifixion with nails driven through the palms, but anatomy proves the palms cannot support human body weight. The shroud aligns with the brutal mechanical reality of the era, showing puncture wounds through the structural bones of the wrists and the heels. The cloth also corrects the traditional image of a neat, woven ring of thorns. The shroud reveals severe puncture wounds across the entire scalp, indicating the victim wore a full, structural helmet of thorns. For this to be a 13th century forgery, the artist would have needed anachronistic knowledge of 1st century Roman protocols, details that remained buried in history for hundreds of years. Microscopic analysis shifts the focus to biology. The linen is saturated with human blood, specifically type AB, which is consistent with Semitic populations. Pathologists can even identify different stages of the trauma. They found pre-mortem blood from the physical beating, along with post-mortem blood mixed with pulmonary edema, a fluid that builds up in the lungs during asphyxiation. That post-mortem fluid flows from a specific puncture wound between the 5th and 6th ribs, matching the upward angle of a Roman infantry spear thrust used to confirm death. Beyond biology, geologists found trace amounts of dirt embedded in the linen fibers. These samples are concentrated at the tip of the nose, the knees, and the heels, the contact points of a heavy face-first fall. This soil contains a limestone and clay signature native only to Jerusalem. Trapped within the weave are also pollen spores from plants that bloom in the Middle East during the spring. These markers physically tie the body to the specific environment of 1st century Jerusalem. The medieval hoax theory faces its biggest challenge when cross-referenced with the Sudarium of Oviedo. This smaller headcloth shows an identical blood type, identical edema stains, and a 1-to-1 anatomical match with the face seen on the shroud. Unlike the shroud, the Sudarium has a documented historical provenance. Records track this specific face cloth back to at least the 600s AD. Because this matching face cloth existed 6 centuries before the shroud was supposedly forged, the 1988 carbon dating results are historically impossible to reconcile. The investigation provides a verified profile, a victim of a 1st century Roman crucifixion, forensically anchored to Jerusalem. But this leads to a question of physics. If the image wasn't painted or photographed, what mechanism altered the cloth? Physicists discovered that the image is the result of a microscopic, cold chemical change that altered the molecular structure of the linen fibers. Replicating that specific molecular change would require a directional burst of radiation, emitting 34,000 billion watts of energy. The timing had to be exact. This release of energy occurred in roughly 1/40th of a billionth of a second. Any longer, and the cloth would have been incinerated. The findings suggest the image was seared into the fibers by a sudden, inexplicable flash of light emanating directly from the body. To determine if this could be anyone else, Mathematicians at the University of Turin assigned a probability to each anatomical, biological, and historical detail found on the cloth. When those variables are combined, the odds of these specific markers belonging to anyone other than Jesus of Nazareth are 1 in 200 billion. The shroud remains a physical, measurable footprint of a resurrection event that science can observe and quantify, even if it cannot explain the source.